Hey, is this better now?
That one is definitely better.
Yeah, good. We didn't. I think
we did nothing.
And I think that fixed it. We rearranged the Coke cans and plugged things in.
Diet Coke cans, first of all.
Held hands and rebooted it.
We didn't hold hands in the Diet Coke can. So there's like, I mean, let's get let's get the details correct at least.
Okay, we have a guest.
Significant improvement, but there's still issues. Well, they're always still. I mean, there are always issues.
There's still issues.
Yeah, I think that's like every
performance review.
I know, pretty much.
Like, go ahead, just leave that comment on your iTunes podcast.
No, please
Be like Oxide and Friends.
Significant improvement,
but still issues.
It's like I see this seems to be written in permanent marker. This is like, wait a minute.
Why is that a tattoo? We have a guest.
We do have a guest.
Where are you, guest?
Yeah, good. What a circus. All right. Well, hopefully. What's going on? Diet Coke.
Normal day at the computer factory where the audio never works.
And yes, I am in the office because road construction started on my street 35 minutes ago. So I busted into the car.
That was that was not a like you wanted to celebrate our work time recording of the podcast by being at work. That was a like, oh my God, there's construction.
No, there's construction right outside my window.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Bryan had to scramble to find pants.
That is not true. You said I am coming in to the litter box and I don't want to walk in on you not wearing pants.
Yes.
And I thought, well, I was walking in as I read that, and I thought you said, I'm coming to the litter box and I'm not wearing pants. And I'm like, this is getting a little too familiar. Yeah. I feel. I mean, look. I mean, we've shared a room on the road before, but
it's been a minute.
It's been a minute, exactly. I know. Before or after the last time I had friends help me move, I feel that's another kind of.
Gotta be before, but it was like Sun Network, Shanghai,
2003. I think that is before the last time. But yeah, I know. 22 years ago.
God,
I know.
It was amazing. Back in the Stone Ages, we were so committed to saving money for the stupid company that we were like, sure, we'll just share a room.
There was I don't even recall the decision process that led us to that.
No.
Have I confided how that had an enormous influence on me though? Have I told you this?
Yes. I know that rooming situation changed your life.
It did change my life.
I feel like you should explain because otherwise it's actually less weird.
It's actually less weird than people's minds are going to
from now on. Little spoon only.
So this is actually less weird. I know you're right. We have to, at this point, we have to go all the way through to actually make it less weird. No, because we were both, I had been using for no good real reason. I'd been using an electric shaver. I barely need to shave at all. Why am I using an electric shaver?
Well,
people are like, where am I right now?
The good reason was your mom got you the shaver, right?
Actually this is sad. Single parent household. This had been left behind.
Oh God!
So it was like it was a Norelco. So now we're way too much information. It's like a Norelco from 1971, and in particular, it's not designed to adjust itself based on the frequency of the AC current. So it would go twice as fast in Shanghai. So it's losing its mind in Shanghai. And I am having to vacuum my face very slowly and efficiently. Okay. And admittedly, it didn't enter my mind that well, maybe you're using a Norelco from 1971 and that's part of the problem. And we were both had to shave before doing whatever presentation, which makes it sound like we were on some black tie dinner, but which it definitely was not. I think was this before or after the extremely racist remarks from the VP that we were traveling with?
I was just trying to place those extremely racist remarks by that VP.
Oh God, it was so bad. It was
both of us trying to disappear, trying to conjure ourselves into non-existence.
Exactly. Please let me go somewhere else. But and you were shaving with a razor.
Yeah.
And you were just in, out, done.
Done.
I was, and I'm
efficient.
Very efficient. And I never thought of it. I had been here I'd been, This is, like
Here you are trying to chain start your gas powered.
my mom didn't teach me how to shave. Okay. Are you happy now?
Yeah.
You're a real father figure for me in a lot of ways. So
Anyway, you're welcome, Germany.
welcome to the podcast, everybody. We don't even know what we're talking about today. No.
Exactly.
All right. Sorry. I'm like so sorry in so many different dimensions. Dirkjan, first of all, welcome to the podcast. Steve, thank you both for joining us. And just to give some context.
Sure. Orient everyone.
Should we orient everyone? We're not here merely to talk about too much information about the life lessons I've learned from Adam. We're here to talk about actually a pretty interesting thing in a lot of ways. So there was an issue with rustup that had this kind of outsized effect and was wound back. But we're going to get to all of that. I think that there's a lot to talk about though. But maybe we can start, Steve, by giving it an introduction to rustup. Rustup is a really important part of the ecosystem. I think it has been around as long as I've been. It's since 2018 at least. Yeah. So it was around in 2015.
I don't remember 2015.
It is a pre 1.0 tool. Yes.
Okay.
Got it.
So, Steve, can you maybe give us some history of rustup? Because I think rustup has been a really important kind of linchpin for the accessibility of Rust, approachability of Rust.
Yeah. So one of the things that helped Rust succeed overall, not toot my own horn too much, is that me and several other early people had a lot of experience in previous language ecosystems. And so we kind of had a list of stuff in our head that's this is all the stuff that you actually need to have to make a language successful. And so one of those things that was very obvious to us was, well, you're going to want to have multiple versions of Rust installed and you're going to be able to manage them. And so there's very clearly an existing, pattern for that, which is to create some sort of tool that lets you manage language versions. And so we kind of knew that was important.
So, Steve, this is coming as it sounds like this is coming as a positive lesson from something that other Ruby in particular did, right? Or where is this what other language come from?
There are other languages too, but definitely I brought over a bunch of Rubyists. There was a long time when I was going to just Ruby conferences and talking about Rust. So I was trying to bring everybody over, and there's actually kind of a longer tangent we may or may not get into about that a little bit later, but it's kind of interesting. But the point is that Ruby had actually several competing tools, and actually, now that I'm thinking about it, this might even be why I was kind of a little stressing about the situation. So the deal is that actually, this is the commit graph says 2016. So I might actually be wrong, and it might be 2016. So there was also okay. No, this is why this is remembering history is kind of hard. So the deal is that we did know we needed to do this, and in Ruby particularly, there was a couple different tools that did this kind of thing. And the first one was called RVM for Ruby Version Manager. And it was written by a guy named Wayne Seguin, and he did a bunch of different stuff in the Ruby ecosystem, but he wrote this sort of, this Ruby version manager, as it says on the tin. And the strategy that it took technically was kind of interesting, but it became... So Ruby, like Python and some other languages of that vintage, essentially operated under the assumption that you only had one version of everything installed on a computer. The Ruby gems, which are the package directory, is a global directory on your computer, and it kind of just assumes that things works. And so once you sort of get into this, future world where it's not 1995 anymore, and you have developers who have multiple projects and they need multiple versions of a language installed, and they kind of want packages to be scoped per project instead of per computer, you sort of end up trying to take this existing code base and trying to retrofit, all of this sort of almost sandboxing onto an environment that was just not designed for it at first. And so tools like RVM were honestly pretty heroic. And same thing with some of the Python equivalents that existed, because frankly they're trying to fight the language itself in some ways, or implementation. So what this means is though, because it's how you install your toolchain, it's also the first point of contact for users with your toolchain, and therefore it also is an opportunity to either succeed or fail at managing those users' expectations. And so like a lot of people ended
This
up
is like
getting
the
kind of
unboxing experience for a program.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
There's something to be said for that. It's like it's something that like wasn't taken seriously until I think Jobs was the first one to really take that seriously. It feels like from a consumer electronics perspective. Is that
that's right?
I don't think that's a total misread. And
Steve Jobs
and
wants you to
everybody-
believe that, even if it's not true. Like sure, like it probably is, but also like he wants to take credit for that, so it's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's like it is the kind of unboxing experience of like and Steve, I like the way you kind of phrase that. It's like this is your first touch point with a potentially new user, and if things go like you might not have that much time.
No, like it's the most like vulnerable point, right? If they have their toe, they're just being like, never mind,
forget it. The whole thing's broken.
Exactly. Why would I? And actually, I'm sure everyone has had that experience. Like I've definitely had that experience where like the first program I ran in Babel or whatever, like segfaulted. I'm like, well,
is Babel a thing, or did you just make that up?
That's a thing.
It was a thing.
It's a transpiler for JavaScript.
Yeah,
is that a thing?
Very good, actually.
Exactly.
Everyone play a lot.
It was actually really important in the history of JavaScript. Like honestly, it's like kind of a big deal. And part of that is because of like being able to forward port language extension stuff. Like the name is appropriate because the idea is that you're taking all these different variants of JavaScript that like may not even be kind of like real, and then porting them to existing JavaScript. So you could like try out like a proposal for JavaScript by including the appropriate Babel plugin. And so like,
okay, is this like Babel?
Yes, like the Tower of
Tower of Babel.
Yeah,
yes,
it's not the tower.
That's why it's named well. Yeah.
I've been. Well, let's move right along.
Anyway,
announcing it for 5,000 years.
yeah.
Well, I guess my bloodline has always pronounced that differently. Really, it's okay.
Yeah.
You know what? I don't need to confide how I was pronouncing it. The point is, I know how to pronounce
Babel. You got
correctly,
Babel or Babel,
and it may or may not be a transpiler for JavaScript. That seems like very like I don't know. This seems like very auto generated. Dirkjan, are you here? Do we have?
I am here. Can you
Hey,
hear me?
oh, right. Speaking of mispronunciation, am I butchering your name?
No, it's fine. I pronounce it Dirkjan.
Dirkjan. Yeah, there we go. Okay, yeah. Although
that's what you were trying.
No, I know. This is the thing. This is like, because and Dirkjan, you're Dutch, right? I mean, I think the Dutch
yes.
the Danish are similar, where you will attempt to pronounce it, and they'll just say the thing again, and then you say it, and then they say it, and you're like,
I get it. Like I'm saying it right?
Like, you're saying you're.
I can see that you're trying.
I can see you're saying it the way you're saying
close enough. Right.
It's close enough. Exactly.
The best it's gonna get.
Right. Yeah. So sorry, Steve. We were back on and
so RVM. Yeah, RVM unboxing experience. First time you get in touch with the toolchain, and like the toolchain was kind of resisting your ability to do that. I mean, I'm not going to say Upstream is unsympathetic to this, but there's just a lot of history there. You know what I mean? And so you have to find all those edge cases and fix them. And so like the technical strategy that RVM took to implement this, I don't like super want to get into the details, but the point is it's not the only way to accomplish this task. And so other people kind of had gotten a little bit fed up with some of the like what they perceived as like bugs in RVM, which were really about bugs in like trying to wrangle this toolchain at all, plus some aspects of its technical implementation. And so then there became a second tool called RBEnv, ENV, that sort of was like an RVM replacement. And a lot of people, like Sam Stevenson wrote RBEnv originally, if I remember correctly, and like Sam, there was some drama way back in the day. I don't want to like get back into it because I think it's all dead and buried at this point in time. But I don't want to say this is Sam's fault. But let's just say that in general, the community, some RBEnv users got very shitty about RVM and kind of like talked about it in a very like, this obsoletes this piece of shit tool and like we have the great thing instead. And so there was like some degree of like bad blood. And then eventually Wayne ended up like quitting open source entirely. And I don't think I've talked to him for like 15 years or something at this point. And I hope he's doing well. But like, because essentially people were just trash talking this thing that he was like selflessly working on for free in his spare time that was holding up every Ruby install ever, essentially.
Oh, interesting. I guess for things to have bad blood between things that are like have very close pronunciations. It's like, wait a minute, did you say RB? I don't know. Friend or foe? Did you say RBM for RBM? I mean, this is the RBM. No, wait a minute. This is the
Judean
people's front. Exactly, people's front Judea.
So yeah. So anyway, not placing the blame of that drama on any specific person, but just like that's my recollection was that it got a little heated somehow over things, and then Wayne quit, and so that was like pretty frustrating and a little upsetting. But life goes on and things happen. So that's probably honestly part of this drama is that situation is probably in the back of my head. I literally didn't think about it until I started like explaining this history actually. And so that's maybe why I got a little worried when this happened, because I'm like remembering how that happened. So
Yeah,
anyway,
this can be this is an aspect of an ecosystem that can become divisive.
yes. And like,
Yeah.
you know, I definitely was involved in a lot of various Ruby drama over the years, and you know, I had complicated feelings about all that. But just like, you know, community expectations and making everybody get along reasonably well and all that stuff was like very on my mind. And like, it also was a big part of like me getting into Rust. But I'm not going to get on a tangent right now. Maybe that's a fun thing to talk about later. But the important part is like we knew that you needed some kind of tool like this, and a lot of scripting languages have a tool that's very similar, and you know, do various things. And so we were like, okay, we need to have some way of managing the toolchain. And so rustup.sh was born, which I believe was what it was called. Now that I'm looking at the repo, it might have been something else slightly. I don't remember, but there was sort of like an initial version of rustup that was like written in shell, if I remember correctly. Like it was a bash script.
Right.
And I believe it was Bryan Anderson.
I think the first commit is from 2016, something February.
Yeah. Well, that's so like I was looking at the history on GitHub, and like rustup is 2016, but also I feel like, well, October 2015 there was like an initial 150 commits apparently it says, but I thought we did it before 1.0 because I thought it was like really important that we had something going on. And so I was also looking at rustup.sh, and it also has April 2015. So I think that's sort of what happened was like and there is like a couple commits at the end of October. So I think there was sort of like a 6 or 9 month period where rustup.sh existed, but then it was very clear that like a pile of bash scripts is not a good way to go. And so rewriting rustup in Rust became a thing that Bryan did as well. And so I think that there was like a pretty short history there overall. But I probably should have looked that up before the episode. Oh, well. But that's like my recollection was like, we knew we needed this thing. Bryan made it happen. And so then, you know, that became the thing.
And then rustup, I mean, unlike I guess the Ruby community where there ended up being two of these things, rustup is really the way to do this and became a really important part of the ecosystem.
A significant difference about Rust's mentality versus a lot of other language ecosystems is that like the Rust project understands that it is producing a product and had like a very like startup-y kind of like mentality for better and for worse. And so like the Rust project has under its purview a lot of things that other language ecosystems don't consider to be part of the language development itself. Like these tools in Ruby are not managed by the Ruby core team or, you know, even the Ruby language team at all. Like they are totally separate projects. And like NVM in Node is like, last I checked, not under, you know, the Node Foundation or whatever. And like, you know, they're sort of made by additional people. And so Rust tends to have less like ecosystem diversity in tooling because it tends to like absorb the most popular thing and therefore consolidate development effort on a single thing instead, for good and for worse.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So you see this with like, I mean, Cargo Clippy or Rust format, or this kind of like there aren't like 6 different ways of doing things. There's actually kind of there's one way where there's consensus on.
Yeah. It's also interesting because that's true in tools, but not true in packages. Like, you know, Rust refuses to sort of bless an error handling package, but also gives you a version manager. You know what I mean? So like, it's not always like, you know, the same exact thing. Paolo in the chat, docs.rs is kind of an interesting version of this too, where so Rust doc is made by the Rust project, but then the idea of like hosting a Rust doc for every single package on crates.io was a third party person's like idea, and then he made it and then eventually donated it back to the Rust project, and so it kind of became official. And so sometimes those sort of things happen, you know, as well. You know, because like Bryan was on the Rust core team employed by Mozilla working on Rust, but like it was like rustup.sh was originally under his GitHub handle personally, if I remember correctly, and then, you know, it became adopted into the project. So that does like happen sometimes too. And same thing with like Manish and Clippy and, you know, et cetera, blah, blah, blah.
It seems like the early commits are actually from Dickory Blake, and then at some point it looks like Bryan takes over.
Yeah, interesting. And this is kind of like, this is overly reductive, but this is called kind of batteries included by, you know, this is the kind of way people think of it. But in reality, like there are batteries everywhere on this thing. So it's like, actually, which batteries some batteries you include, or one person's battery is another person's accessory. I mean, I think there's I think that, as you say, Steve, it's like the line that Rust has drawn is not always completely consistent, but does feel like there's a line there around kind of the more of the meta stuff versus the crate ecosystem, for example.
Yeah, I feel like the difference is like for toolchain stuff, like you really got to nail that experience to have things work well. And so there's advantages to consolidating. But in the package ecosystem, there's like a more significant variety of things you need. Like, a way to manage Rust versions is a pretty narrow kind of like scope. But like, here are all the packages you're going to want to write your program is like pretty freaking huge, actually. And different things approach this differently. So, for example, like sort of semi-controversially, C++ 2026 is going to include linear algebra in the standard. And like, there's a whole bunch of good reasons why that's true and bad reasons why people are mad that that's true. And like, et cetera, blah, blah. There was a movement for a minute to like include a GUI toolkit in the standard. And like, that was a whole, like a lot of people fought back against that. And like, yada yada. There's interesting good reasons why that would be a good idea, but also a lot of bad reasons why it's not about. So anyway, every sort of language has to confront how they organize socially and then how they like produce the product that people end up actually using. And I think Rust understands and cares about that a lot more, or like I should say, the Rust project cares about that a lot more and understands that explicitly. Or at least we used to in the old days. I haven't really been involved lately. I see some signs of that mentality still being the case, but I can't really speak to the way discussions happen since I'm not like involved anymore.
Yeah, interesting. And then Dirkjan, when did you get involved with rustup?
I was looking at that. I think it was in 2023 sometime. I think there was a call for help in Zulip, I think. So there was like basically one maintainer left and he wasn't very active and still isn't. And so we had two sort of people come on board and join the project. And then more recently, I invited a third. So there's now 3 active maintainers.
And then when had you, what is kind of your own history with rustup? So that's how long you've been kind of contributing to it. Like, what's kind of your own history with respect to Rust? And obviously,
so I started
the call.
Writing Rust in 2016, I think. I initially wrote some sort of OIDC IDP, so OpenID Connect thing. And then I wrote Ascama, which is this template engine that people might be familiar with. And then I started on Quinn, the quick implementation, and did a whole bunch of other stuff.
And then, so a call goes out that this is an under-maintained part of the ecosystem. And I feel like when those calls go out, like most people are like, oh, that's too bad.
Oh, totally. Especially for something like that, where, for a crate, like if we were using a crate in Anchor, like I'll give you an example just off the top of my mind. Like there's this crate that we use, a lot of people use for open API stuff. And the owner of it just sort of wandered off and was like, look, this is not my day job. And it was extremely generous and just saying like, come on in. Like, right. If you're using it, go ahead and own it. But for something like rustup that sort of falls between the couch cushions where it's like everyone uses it. It's not like, it's not, you're not betting your business on rustup. It's the thing you used for that moment and you don't think about until it doesn't work.
So Dirkjan, what kind of went into you heeding the call to jump in on that? Because it is, as Adam says, it's like, I can't imagine that you've got a rustup based business, but maybe you do.
No, I do not. I have some GitHub sponsoring for stuff like this. So this is not the first time this happened to me. So I now maintain Chrono, which I didn't start out maintaining. I now maintain FlameGraph. I now maintain Indicatif, the progress bar library. So there's a bunch of projects that sort of got orphaned, and I was using them, and I was like, well, someone will have to do it, and so I just started doing it. And so for rustup, I think someone was like, it needs more maintainers, and I started just looking at the repository and doing like little, dependency upgrades, a little clippy, a little formatting, stuff like that. Yeah. And then stuff got merged, and I did some more refactoring, and that sort of spiraled out of control.
And people are asking, Indicatif is the progress bar library that actually we neglected to mention, I think, on crates that we love, but I love that. I love it. I
use it a lot.
I use it a lot. I use it all over the place. Yeah, I think it's great.
Yeah, it's pretty nice. And so at some point I did like 100x speed up by doing like better atomics or something. So that's fun for me. And I guess good for the ecosystem. So
I use it for a process that takes like over an hour to happen, and it's like the only thing that makes it seem like it's doing anything because it sits there and just slowly fills up the bar. So yeah.
So you're getting involved in the Rustup and starting to fix bugs. Things are getting integrated and so on. And then
the other like beef. So I also became a Rustls maintainer at some point, right? The TLS library. And so one of my long-standing beefs with Rustup was that it was not using request and Rustls, but it was using like curl.
Interesting.
And so obviously that was an angle for me where I was like, oh, now there's people that need to maintain it. I'm going to splice in some Rustls and request.
Maybe revealing some of its bash origins there with the use of curl. It's like some of the bash roots. So you did have like an angle on this of like, hey, I got some things that I want to improve in this thing.
Well, I think that was like a one thing, and then I just at this point I'm pretty like efficient at refactoring Rust to be cleaner. So I just looked at it last night. I've done like 230 commits, and I have net negative lines contribution.
Oh, what a hero! Absolute legend!
Seriously.
Yeah.
Oh, it's like
so this is a bit of a pattern. I have this on a few other projects where I do like a whole bunch of change, but I end up with less code than I started with.
That is outstanding. We honestly should do an episode just on Rust based refactoring. Because I do think I feel Rust has changed my view of refactoring, because I think refactoring can introduce a lot of risk and introduce a lot of problems, and Rust is like way safer for refactoring. I feel
totally agree.
It's also a thing that lots of people say lots of things about. Sorry, go ahead.
I would just say to fans that Bryan is saying that as a non-Rust Analyzer user, which is insane.
Wow,
that's like you use Rust Analyzer, Bryan, it will make you feel all the more that way.
Is this an intervention?
Wasn't.
I exactly. I know. I know. I don't. Unlike syntax highlighting, it's not a point of principle for me. Syntax highlighting is not a point of principle either. Just everyone settle down. I took
Rust for the first like 3 or 4 years with Nano, and then at some point I figured, maybe this IDE stuff is actually good, and so now I use VS Code like everyone else.
Like most other people anyway, like almost everybody else.
Sure, I'm with you, Dirkjan. But yeah, I'm with you, Bryan. That I don't know. I don't do that much stuff in our Lumos code base, but I do every once in a while, and I do feel like I'm operating without a net. I feel
absolutely.
I'm kind of that guy with a lunch pail on the girder, like 30 stories up or whatever.
I think I'm performing surgery on myself.
Yeah. And just like when you're refactoring in particular in Rust code that is decently well tested, you're just like, I'm not going to screw this up.
Yeah. Or I will screw this up many times, but it'll be the compiler that hits me in the
I won't screw this up in a way where everyone else on the team can see.
That's right. I'll screw this up in private.
This would also make a good episode, because there are a lot of people who think refactoring in Rust is terrible, and so getting a little cage fight situation going on would be interesting, I think, as an episode.
Yeah. Huh. All right. Yeah. Enter the octagon, the refactoring octagon. Okay. So Dirkjan, so you are, for the last, year and change, 2 years, you've been, really active in Rustup. It's not a very big team, it sounds like.
I also should say I've been very active. Like, it's among one of the projects that I help out with, and I do code review and some changes here and there. And it's like, not a big part of my experience or something, but
sure, yeah, right,
whenever there's stuff that needs to be done, I help out. And so we were working towards this release for quite a while, and finally we thought now is about time that we start pushing it out. And
okay, so now maybe we can start kind of talking about the specific change, or maybe let's talk about the behavior prior to this change. Do you want to kind of elaborate on the prior behavior, Dirkjan?
Yes. So a bit of a caveat. I didn't work on this change myself, so I reviewed the code, but I don't have a deep understanding of it, at least for my feeling. But so basically, the toolchain or Rustup will install toolchain implicitly whenever you call a command that needs it. And that's even like if you do a cargo version or something, it will go and install a toolchain if the toolchain is not there.
And so when you say you'll call a toolchain, so it will look at the Rust toolchain.toml file and
if there, and even if it's not there, right, it will go and fetch maybe the stable toolchain or something.
Yeah, interesting. And so And so this is kind of an interesting behavior because on the one hand, this makes Rust easier to use at some level.
Yes,
I mean,
definitely.
but it's also implicit behavior, and it is a little surprising that I do like a cargo version or whatever. I run a command that doesn't feel like it should be talking to the internet for a while.
And it like goes and downloads 2 gigabytes.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Stuff.
Like I want to be on my Zoom call, and apparently I can't do that because we're going to update the app.
And that's when you're running it from the command line, right? And it could also be running in the backend somewhere in your Rust analyzer install, and it will do the same thing implicitly without you noticing or even like triggering it consciously.
And I do think that this is like a very common tension between making something approachable and making something rigorous. And I mean, to take like I think a comical extreme of this is, and it was definitely an early, I would say, reflection of a values divide between Node and Joyent back in the day was so npm. If you do npm isintall, ISNTALL,
okay, it
will treat that as npm install.
Okay.
And
because it's like close enough, I get what you're talking about.
Close enough, I get what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And and this was
doesn't mean your bash scripts are just like riddled with
exactly.
I guess
that's right. Yeah. And that's exactly. I mean, you can kind of see the whole like one act play in front of you, right?
And then when you add a new subcommand, it's like, oh, now I'm not sure what your typo means.
Exactly. And I mean, I think, and then also like you can never take it away. And I think that I understand how we got there, but I think that from if you were on the rigor side of the rigor v approachability divide in Node, it was ridiculous to have a command that is clearly not the command do something else.
I feel like it shows like kind of a lack of respect for users. Like we needed the bar to be so low, because if you type
ASDF, I'm
going to type isn't all, and it doesn't work, and we tell them you should have written install, like they're just not going to do it.
They're not going to do it. They're not going to do it.
That's a level of patience that we cannot assume in our users.
Right. They're all just big babies.
So as someone who never has written any Node, I would feel like it's kind of lonely probably on the rigor side of the NPM debate.
That was phrased wonderfully, honestly.
That was phrased very wonderfully. It was, and I would say it was the only thing that the reason it wasn't completely lonely is that there was a group of us that were marooned on Rigor Island together, and we all had one another to like, but it was, there's a platform as a reflection of values is a talk I gave on the
familiar
whole
with it, yes.
Yeah, on the whole divide that it was lonely.
And then I gave a talk based on it that then ended up, being like about Rust's take on Bryan's take, and then eventually got worked here.
And actually, in all honesty, like that, the NPM isintall thing, I actually became more forgiving of after having done my talk, because I think I wasn't giving it the credit of like, to me, it was like back in the day, I'm like, this is valueless and stupid.
It's like right or wrong, but it's not right or wrong.
It's not right or wrong, actually. And like, there's actually a reason why it was done. And like, that may be an extraordinary, kind of an extreme example. And I still don't think it was the right behavior, but I think it gave me a lot more sympathy for that of like, okay, I get what you were trying to do. And I kind of feel like this is the rustup implicitly installing a toolchain is an example of like, hey, like I know what the user wants to go do. Like they're trying to run something that's cargo related. There's a toolchain.toml file here. Like I know the toolchain that they want. We should go install it. It just feels like it's implicit behavior, but it also doesn't feel unreasonable to be like, yo, why are we going to the internet? And when we've done a cargo version or whatever.
Right. Hurts your P99 on the
the cargo. Yeah, exactly.
And I would also say, like on the Rust side, the rigor side is a lot busier, right? So I feel like I would have expected, maybe naively, but I would have expected this change to like be welcomed by a certain substantial size of the rustup audience.
Interesting.
Not saying that it's the right thing to do or that it's not going to be painful as a migration, but it's probably still. I still think it might be the right direction, but it's tricky because it is the entry point for Rust and something that people hit a lot, and so implicit install is worth a lot of, not paying.
There's a there's a thing related to this is install thing that so Git also has this ability to like, oh, you typoed something, we should do something else instead. But it has a setting that you can set that says like, please ask me about it. And so I'm kind of wondering if I never like said this about the rustup thing, but like the sort of intention is like, everything just works nicely for you. And so like, it just makes it happen. But one path forward to change this behavior would sort of be like hey, you don't have the toolchain currently installed. Would you like me to go install it? Yes or no? And then ask people about it that way.
Yeah.
And then in scripts, you could do the -- yes and like all that kind of like standard pattern stuff. But
that
anyway, I've
definitely
thought
came
deeply
up
about
as an option,
okay.
right? It was
I assume so.
discussed
Yeah.
in some of the PRs or issues. I feel like it's still putting up a roadblock, right? But people are still going to dislike, and also in all the unattended cases, it's still going to be a flag day.
For sure, absolutely.
Right,
I'm not
so
saying
it
it's a panacea, for sure.
really help from that perspective.
Yeah, you kind of want the computer to like open its eyes and see like, is there a person and a keyboard there? I mean, whether that's looking at the
I've
terminal
been wondering about is it TTY?
Is TTY? Like I know.
Oh, man, even that's even trickier implicit behavior. You're like, wait a minute.
Yes, that's the other problem, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to have heuristics, they better be very easy to understand, or everything is going to suck.
Yeah, totally. So okay, I think it's really interesting, and I think like valid. I mean, you're just like, look, this is the Rust community. These guys, this is a when we choose between, we often choose rigor in Rust, and we're willing to, and so this seems like a choice that's very consistent with what the Rust community want. The change is rolled out into a rust up version. Obviously, there's some discussion about it, and but it's going to be okay. This is going to affect like this may affect some users who are implicitly depending on the implicit behavior. And one of the challenges is, Dirkjan, I don't know if you like. There's no like, how do you figure out who's depending on the implicit behavior? It's really tough because it's implicit, right?
Yeah, so in my mind, like the only way to find out is to try, right? There's really like we did like the internals blog post, which apparently not many people read internals, and we did a release announcement on the main Rust blog, but of course
Also
that's just a
apparently
release announcement that says it's Rust up 128, and it doesn't say pay attention here because we're going to break all your shit. And so maybe that would have been better, like if we had, and maybe we should have done that up front, looking back, to try draw out more of the feedback or criticism of this change. But it's also, again, this is like 3 folks who are doing this in their like bit of spare time here and there. I personally had a challenging month with a bunch of hospital time for my kids, so that was I also personally didn't have much time while we were rolling this out, so it's a bit of a stressful situation when the feces hit the ventilator. So at that point then we got like a bunch of feedback via Blue Sky, and I was like, well, gotta do some work here.
Yeah. Okay. So the first of all, and I absolutely agree, by the way, with your disposition of like at some level, especially when it comes to implicit behavior, you do kind of need to do it. You can't be, because you can be, and I mean, because I think that when we are biased towards fear and like, no, we can't change any behavior, I think that you run the risk of becoming so conservative that it creates a backlash that's much more radical. Whereas like, actually now I don't care what shit breaks, because like I feel we've definitely seen this in Unix, in the operating system, where people are like so afraid to change anything that it creates this radical movement of like, I want to break everything.
Yeah.
And it's like, is there a path between these two things? Like where we can where we can like be smarter about the way that I feel like this always with preserving binary compatibility, where it's like people like, I think we should change nothing versus like, I don't think we should honor binary compatibility. It's like
forever. Right?
Forever. It's like, can't we find a path that like tries to maximize binary compatibility and allows us to like, so I think that you've got to have a disposition towards changing things or like we want to improve them.
Steve, this sounds like some of the struggle of C++. Is it?
Yeah. So I mean, like literally, like the like scars from changing the standard string ABI in C++11, like eventually, you know, in that meme where you have a little person pushing a small domino and it's a bigger domino, it's a bigger domino, it's a bigger domino, right? It's like that starts off with like a change to standard string ABI, and then the end of it is like Google quitting the C++ committee. You know, like that's just like that's like how that like went at 10 years later, 15 years later, or whatever. So yeah, totally, it's hard, and like, you know, it is absolutely true that you want to be able to change stuff, but you also want to be able to keep stuff the same, and figuring out how to make something like that work is something we spent a lot of time like thinking about in the earlier days of Rust, because like we knew like systems, you can't build a house on sand, right? And I really liked Nico put out a blog post yesterday called like
foundational
Rust
software
in 2025 targeting foundational software. And like I agree. I mean, me and Nico disagree on a lot of things, but I like this post, and it's sort of about, you know, like Rust is really good at the foundations of computing. It's also good at higher level stuff, but like that's important. And so you can't build a house on sand. And so just like, you know, to you know, we ragged a little bit on Node earlier, but like Node can change all the time because like that's fine for the stuff that you use Node for. But like Rust in kernels and stuff, like you really don't want to be like changing things constantly, because you need a stable foundation to be able to build other stuff on top of, right? And so the kind of the original release cadence is sort of based on an insight from you know, the like agile folks and sort of like web development, which is like, hey, sometimes we used to have like in my first internship, we had like deploy week, where it was like, okay, no one's doing their job, we're just deploying the next version of the app and like fixing everything that breaks, and like that's gonna just like take a week to work out. And so one of the things that happen is continuous integration, where it's like, you know, you basically try to deploy constantly all the time, because, you know, you only get good at something if you practice it. And so by saying like we're going to deploy 10 times a day, it forces you to get your deploy story real tight, because like you can't do it if it takes a week to deploy. You can't do it 10 times a day. So you like got to make sure that it works and works well. And so I had seen a lot of instances in the Ruby community, and other people had seen in other programming language communities, where because they only release once a year, a proposal that is okay but not fantastic that happens in October is more likely to land than a wonderful proposal that lands in a January. Ruby releases on Christmas, so that's why I always think about it in a yearly schedule kind of like terms. Because there's like, if you miss that release, you're talking like another year until you have a chance for it to land again, and that's like kind of a long time. And so it creates this weird pressure. And so the initial idea of the 6-week release schedule was like, how browsers do that now, where it's like if we release Rust super often, it's totally okay if a feature slips a release, because it's only going to be 6 weeks until the next one. And so I think that's like a lot of people see the quick release schedule and think that that's about rapidly breaking everything, but it's actually kind of the opposite. It's about not putting pressure on shipping a mediocre solution, because it's like totally okay to let it slide for only a small bit of time instead of a large bit of time. And yeah, DJ sees into the chat, like, we have a problem with editions a little bit, and that's why yesterday I learned that apparently there's a talk about doing like small editions every year, because it's sort of running into the same problem, right? Like edition 2018 was a massive cluster of management issues and burned out a lot of people, and then, you know, this edition slipped until 2025, partially because of not wanting to burn people out, because, you know, getting stuff in before it. And so, you know, it's kind of always hard when you release on sort of a longer schedule. And I don't know how I feel about the idea of a yearly edition. Whatever, it's not, sort of a little off topic, but yeah, change management is hard. And turns out that like doing the releases all the time can ease the burden on, you know, not wanting to stay stagnant, while also being relatively stable at the same time.
Yeah. Then with additions too, we've got which I've just learned about recently with Rain's demo, when Rain demo to the format changes in that Rust format, you can have that different aspects of the toolchain can have different editions. So you can be on a 2021 edition, but then on a 2024 edition for Rust format, which I think was or 2025, whatever the yeah, and which I think was actually kind of neat to split some of that a bit. because I think some of these things are like Rust format can be tough to move forward. And
or even just being able to desynchronize those things where you're kind of speculatively moving forward on one while not kind of changing everything at the same time.
Right. So
this also ties back into the everything being under the umbrella. Like it would not be possible to do that kind of coordinated edition-based tool releases, or it'd be much harder if you were trying to coordinate with a total random third party instead of being as part of the project.
Totally. And so Dirkjan, what has been the cadence of rustup releases? Because you mentioned that it'd been it's a couple of months. Is that a fair statement?
So I guess one of the problems actually is that there hasn't been a cadence, and that the last release was really long time ago. So I forget exactly, but we released 1.27.1 on May 6th last year.
Yeah.
And that was after 1.27.0 was on March 11. I don't know. Yeah, that's still 25th.
April 25th for 26, and then like February.
So
3rd
and then there was a long
long
gap where we did feature development stuff. Changes that are user touching, and now release those all at once. And obviously that's harder to manage in terms of change management.
Totally. Okay, so this release goes out, and I think we've all been there. In our careers. Yeah, exactly. Where you have that first moment of like you hit that first raindrop and you're like, that's funny. And then you're like, second raindrop, and it's like, oh, now that's hail.
So I experienced this on social media, like through I saw like Eliza was on Blue Sky and said something like, well, I guess all of my CI and all of my GitHub projects are going to fail. And I just closed Blue Sky and I'm like, you know what? It's Saturday. Like, I'm sure this will detonate soon, and I'll wait for it.
It's actually interesting because I had a bit of a similar experience the week before, or like 2 weeks ago, when Ring went unmaintained. And there was an unmaintained advisory for like this commonly used crypto library that Russell's folks typically use, or that they historically use at least. And so that was also like reaching out and trying to figure out, hey, can the Russell's team take over maintenance so it doesn't have to have an advisory and we don't have to break everyone's audit jobs. And so that felt like a sort of almost like a rehearsal for this in terms of communication, right? Well, lots of people are going to be worried and maybe angry. And so if we just try to communicate that we understand the pain and that we're going to address it soon, might help a bit.
I think it helps a lot for whatever it's worth. I mean, so Steve, you were on kind of the other side of this along with a lot of other people. And I mean, to kind of to lead with the conclusion, I mean, the title of your blog is A Happy Day for Rust. So, I mean, you're kind of watching all this unfold.
Yeah. So, the community aspect of Rust has always been really central to like the things that I care about with Rust. And part of that is because like, I'm going to say some stuff I've said in person, but not in a recorded form before. Like, part of the reason that I came to Rust is I was incredibly dissatisfied with how the Ruby community was operating, but also specifically, like, I was hanging out with DHH and that made me into a jerk. And there was a time where I like overstepped my bounds a little bit and it became this whole thing. And I basically was an asshole to a random person on the internet because I didn't really appreciate that, like, that's what I was doing. I thought I was just like making jokes about a project, and it turns out that was actually like wrong. And so I had a really serious like sit down, come to Jesus, rethink how I act kind of like moment. And I was like, you know what? I don't think that like being around these people is making me a good person. And so that was at the same time I learned that Rust existed, and basically everyone there seemed wonderful. And so I was like, okay, I deliberately want to try and make Rust into a non-toxic community because like I have just been on the other side of that. And my hottest take is that I think that that's why Rails kind of stopped being culturally relevant, which is like a complicated phrase, but like, it's not the darling it once was. And I think that part of that is due to missing the boat on JavaScript, due to, I'll just say bigotry because it's funny, but like anti-JavaScript bigotry from the Rails sort of like world. And so it's like important for both like an ethical thing of like, I want to be around people who are good people instead of bad people. But there's also like sort of a like more dispassionate belief of like, including more people means you get better ideas. And if you drive certain people out of your spaces, you have blind spots based on what those people's things are. And so like, this is where a lot of the like, don't compare Rust to C++ kind of culture came from very early, because I was like, I really, really did not want us to have Rust marketing be C++ sucks, Rust is awesome, you shouldn't use that garbage, because that would be like bad ultimately. And this also goes back to some Nietzsche, but now I'm on 3 levels of tangent, so I won't. So anyway, I've like long and like early Rust was pretty good and healthy and happy, and I kind of always wondered at what point that would end. Like when, you know, you get thousands and thousands of people from all over the world together, even describing it as a community is kind of a little incoherent. You know, it's like actually a sort of constellation of a pocket of various communities instead. And so like, I'd always wondered, like, at what point have we grown to the point where you can't really make those kinds of claims about the Rust community as a whole? And like, when will schisms form? And like, you know, how's all that sort of stuff happen? And so the Actix Web situation was the sort of like first time that I was like, okay, I think maybe that's actually dead. And so, you know, like basically I wrote this blog post, it was back in 2020, called A Sad Day.
What is the Actix? Can you give us some context on the Actix Web situation?
So essentially, like, basically, Actix Web was a web framework written for Rust that got a lot of attention because it was very fast. It scored at the top of some very popular web benchmark stuff, and like the person who wrote it worked at Microsoft and kind of had hinted that Microsoft was using it in production, and so that was like really interesting to people because this is still before, you know, like big companies were like super talking about all the time about using Rust for things. And so sort of the problem though is that one day somebody decided to like look at the code, and it turns out that like it was using a lot of unsafe. And that's not a problem on its own, just to be clear. Like sometimes you got to use a lot of unsafe, but it was like using unsafe code for things that like weren't really necessary to use. Like it wasn't like we profiled this and this is slow and we're using unsafe to like to sort of like replace like code that's bad and safe code. It was more just like, I think this is going to be slow, so we're going to do it for unsafe from the beginning. Right. And Andrew linked in chat a really good post also about contempt culture that also deeply, deeply resonated with me for various reasons. And I kind of didn't want Rust to be a contempt culture in that sense. But anyway, so the problem is that like, okay, that's totally fine. You wrote some unsafe code that you shouldn't have maybe, like, and so people sort of like opened issues and sent in PRs that were like, here is a safe version of this unsafe code. And essentially the author went like, nah, it's fine. I don't care. And like closed them. And that was when the like stuff really went wrong. It wasn't even about, like, a lot of people were saying like, this is about Rust people harassing people about unsafe code. It wasn't really just that. It was like, hey, you don't need to use unsafe here. And then the total lack of like willingness for the author to accept that fact. And now again, it's his code. He can do whatever he wants. Like, I'm not trying to cast like a moral judgment. I'm trying to describe sort of why people got upset. And like, for whatever reason, like, I'm not saying they were right to get upset or they were wrong. I'm just trying to like factually describe the situation. And so that then led to like a whole bunch of Reddit shenanigans, and a bunch of people opened issues, and then it got, you know, linked to like other places, and like I think some 4chaners showed up, and like essentially the author at some point was like, I am just done, and just like quit. And so so anyway, he sort of quit, and in this sort of flurry, and then I wrote this post that basically described the situation, just described in words, but like essentially it was like, I don't know what we're gonna do here, but I was like, this really like put a bad taste in my mouth, because like it just looks bad for everyone, you know? Like, I don't want to be in a community where people decide that a project is wrong and bad, and therefore they swarm with a bunch of issues. I don't want a maintainer to, you know, feel crappy when people criticize something about their project, because like it is also true that like the only way you get better is by being told that like, hey, you did something that's like not optimal, and here's like a better way to do it. Right there, criticism has to be okay. But there's like a difference between like criticism and critique versus like, you know, saying like, this is garbage and you suck.
I mean, so when I kind of initially fell in love with Rust and had this thing that I had re-implemented that wasn't a kind of a C node hybrid that I re-implemented in Rust, and I was delighted with the results, and I wrote a blog post about it that went viral. A lot of people were reading it, and there were some PRs on the thing that I had open sourced about, like, hey, there's there's a slightly better way to do this. And it was from David Tolnay.
Oh, wow.
And it felt like, oh my God, like this feels like great. Because first of all, I just by the fact that you're opening, like you're talking about these like small things, like you're reading the code carefully, and it's not completely wrong. Not everything about this is wrong. And I loved having that feedback of like, there's a better way to do this.
I've had my own sort of David Tolnay elf on the shelf moment where like he just materialized in some repo and showed me a better way. It was delightful.
Right. And I think so. You do have to like, I think, Steve, I hear what you're saying, but kind of like no one in that sad day is overly sympathetic, because I think like a maintainer, like if people are saying like, hey, I think there's a better way to do this and here's what it looks like, closing that out is like, go fuck yourself. It's not gonna like that's if the objective is to like, keep Reddit at bay, that's probably not going to work very well.
But you also don't want people showing up with their safety pitchforks.
Their safety pitchforks, and also like, Steve has like, and at some point the 4chaners showed up. It's like, that is definitely like, okay, we are definitely off the rails.
Yeah.
Very, very, very off the rails. So
and like to be clear, there also was one like actual like unsound implementation of something too. Like sometimes it was unnecessary, but then it also, once you start digging, you find things, and there were some things that were like legitimately like, this is not actually correct. And so, that becomes a bigger issue then too also. So like,
oh my God, I have been Dirkjan has absolutely busted me with a
Like
oh my God, no,
from 30 years ago.
From 30 years ago on Structa. Oh my God, I feel so bad.
Closed will not implement.
More having an argument first. Oh God. Okay, I'll show myself out.
Came with the receipts.
It came with the receipts. Oh man. We can cut this out, right? We don't need to put this in the show notes.
We could. No, but for sure we could cut it out.
You know what? Hey, you've been editing a lot of these. Why don't you let me take one? I just feel like I want to take a load off your shoulders. And
yeah,
makes sense. Let me edit
this
this
also
one.
true that like, you never know. Like DJ said earlier, right? He has a situation personally that like made it a little tough to deal with this response, and like you never know what's going on with anybody else's life outside of the GitHub issue, and that's true. Both as like the person who says something a little spicy and the person who's receiving the spicy message too, right? And so there's always just humans are hard. It turns out it's not easy to get along in any context.
Yeah. Okay. So Dirkjan, let's get back to that kind of moment of like, this is like, I think this change is having, we're going to have to revisit this. What was kind of going through your head?
I was like, first, let's do some communication, right, on Blue Sky and on Mastodon, just to get the word out that we see the feedback. And then, there were some issues in the issue tracker as well, so I responded on there, and also tried to put out sort of a roadmap of changes that we should make to address basically the worst of the feedback.
Yeah.
Or the worst of the issues surfaced by the feedback, I should say. And that was also in part so because at least the person who had made this change was not online at the time. They're in Asia. And
right.
So I was trying to also provide a roadmap for them if they went online and were like, is there something I can do to have like a clear picture of like, where do we go next? Right.
God, I can't imagine waking up into this.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that sucked for them. I think he sunk a lot of his free time, like all of his free time for like 2 or 3 days into fixing the situation.
So I think the early communication, I think obviously you're expressing that like, okay, we appreciate that this has had an outsized impact. Because I feel that like you handled it really, really well. I think from what was clearly a tough situation. What was kind of guiding you into? Clearly you got a lot of experience dealing with open source. You've dealt with a lot of things. You have obviously dealt with terrible maintainers yourself, like me, on a project. You had some examples of how not to handle things, I guess. But at what point you're just like, okay, I think we actually need to because ultimately the change was effectively reverted, correct?
Yes, the change was reverted. and well, we left like an environment variable in place that you can use if you want to stick to the new behavior.
Right.
So people can start to adapt to it. And then we haven't really had the discussion yet of where do we go from here, basically, right? Do we still try to get enough of the community on board that this is a good idea and provide a better migration path that we're going to do it, that we're going to make it at least not implicit install by default, and then maybe have an option where you can opt into enabling implicit installs for your environment, or if we're just gonna stay away from that because it's too big of a change.
Yeah.
So I think that still needs to happen, right? I think we need to have a better story to explain why we need to make this change, and then see if we can convince basically the people that might be a good idea after all.
Yeah. And then Steve, you've got kind of the Actix Web kind of debacle on your mind as you're watching this. And then what's your take on kind of the reaction that you're seeing?
Well, it's when I initially posted, with that understanding that like I'm trying to not be a jerk when I criticize someone in something, like I thought a lot about how I should say what I said. And so like what I said was like, I wish this had been handled differently, which is like different than, hey, this fucking sucks. And like, I really wanted to try to like figure out how to get across the like, this isn't great, but also I'm really not trying to make your life hell and I'm sorry, kind of like thing. And so it was like really difficult to walk that line. And furthermore, like because I kind of have a complicated relationship with the project these days, I never, when I'm criticizing the Rust project specifically, I like try to be careful about it because I suspect that if I push too hard on a thing, that actually does the opposite effect of what I want. And so like there's a little bit of, stuff going on there too. But first and foremost, I'm just like not trying to make somebody's Tuesday a bad day randomly. Cause like I have been on the other side of that. Like there was one day that I woke up to, hey, in an hour or two, we're going to announce RCE on every version of Rails ever that affects every Rails app that's ever been deployed. So good luck. And like that's sucked. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I'm not going to derail this with even more of those things, but like the point is I've been there and it's terrible and I don't want to have that happen to other people. But at the same time, you got to sort of communicate like, maybe this could have been done better and how can we make this not happen in the future and like that kind of stuff. And so, I decided I was just going to make the blue sky post and like that's it because like ultimately my CI didn't break actually, and that's because I've been cargo culting a specific test.yaml workflow that includes setting the toolchain deliberately and installing it on my own. So like it didn't actually break anything that I'm aware of, and
it also really helps that GitHub Actions doesn't actually pull these in very quickly. So we had like a few days until like everyone would be affected.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Happy coincidence, or
because like they include rustup on their runners is the thing. Like you don't end up installing separate stuff. And so yeah.
So because I think I had assumed that we got broken by it very shortly after it integrated.
We did, yeah.
But we were on. Were we more on the leading edge of being broken by it?
I think mostly that's because we're doing our build them out custom runners rather than using the GitHub runners.
Got it.
And also there's like a build script in Helix, I think, that like does stuff around this. And so like we're weird in many ways. And so our weirdness causes us to be exposed to it.
This is just being told to me for the first time. I've not heard this at all. So we're on the leading edge of this, of feeling this breakage. And I think that, I think Ileana and Josh may have been both active on the issue, but we're both, I think, expressing our the pain that we were in anyway. And so Dirkjan, do you make the decision to revert it? Kind of talking to the original contributor? You kind of wait for them to get up, or how did that work from your end?
I wrote this list of things that I personally think should be done. And then by the time I woke up, or like the next morning, he had already put up a PR that basically reverted to behavior, had list like this environment variable escape valve. So that was sort of implicitly agreed upon. We did not have much of an explicit conversation about it. Because it was clear, right? We're not going to break everyone who has not who does not have like the GitHub delay, basically. So we need to revert this, and then we can assess basically how we want to move forward with this at a more easy pace, right? Since we're all volunteers and doing this as a side job.
Totally. And deeply, deeply, deeply appreciated, by the way. I mean, I just feel that like, I mean, you've picked up a bunch of things that are essential to the ecosystem. And like, I mean, having rustup not use curl, for example, like that's a big win. I mean, there's like a bunch of like really important to get this really foundational, that you're making a bunch of important changes here.
And it's weird because I think we hit on this earlier, but like these sort of foundational things are not easy to fund, right? No one is asking for this. I think, Adam, you were talking about this like rustup. You know, you just sort of rely on it working and you don't think about it. You're not gonna really fund it or whatever. It's just sort of happening. And that's true for like a lot of these projects. Like people are just depending on there somewhere deep in their dependency graph, or maybe not so deep. And then you hope that it continues being maintained and maybe improves a little bit over time. But it just
Adam would love another excuse to run another physics simulation for the graphic. But the kind of the idea of the sole maintainer on the thing that is like, because I think that part of the reason that graphic is memorable is because the foundation itself is rickety, right? The thing that it's leaning on is itself like not robust,
right?
And we actually want to make that thing robust. And I think, and across the board, I think Rust is actually much more robust than many other things that have come before it, in part because it's learned lessons from things that have come before. But in order for those things to be robust, they need to have maintainers. They need to be able to make the kind of changes that you all are making, Dirkjan, to give it that truly robust foundation.
Yeah, and someone has to be around to actually review and merge PRs, right? And for some projects, that's enough, and it's not a very intense task, but someone has to do the job. And so sometimes for things that I use or used at some point, I'll take that job and just spend a little time on it.
And so, I mean, I don't know how many times you had to rewrite some of the things that some of the GitHub issues, Dirkjan, but I just felt like you were an exemplar of like, I mean, really like listening to everybody and
crisis PR,
total crisis PR, PR. And like not, I mean, it's so tempting to get, like, it's so tempting to be the asshole that I was when Dirkjan opened the PR and be like
agree to disagree.
Yeah, defensive and everything else. And, you know, you weren't any of those things. And which I think was I think, Steve, to kind of your blog entry about the Happy Day for Rust, I mean, it's like that was kind of uplifting to see that, like, okay, this is actually reinforcing a lot of what's right about the community, instead of highlighting some things that might be wrong about it.
Right. I also want to say, yes, as someone who's had to do a lot of crisis PR for open source teams, I think that you did a fantastic job, Dirkjan, at doing that. And to sort of echo what you said, right? Like the thing that connected these in my mind specifically, especially, was that like, right, it was the response was what mattered. It wasn't in the Actix web situation. It wasn't the unsafe code existed inherently. It was like the response caused a lot of the problem. Yeah. And so like when somebody does something that you don't like I was like, oh man, like rustup is going to change in this breaking way and it's going to break people. And like, I'm always telling people how stable Rust is. And this is like, people are going to use this as like an example of how Rust is unstable and blah, blah, blah. And like all that kind of like stinks. But like, then, so that like feels like a lack of, when you think about the way that projects make decisions, like for example, like I'm like medium on the Lang team these days because I feel like they have an appetite for change that's much larger than I personally have for the language. And so I don't like trust them a ton. I mean, I do and don't, but like, you kind of like, you're trying to think about like, okay, how is this thing that represents me going to make decisions that I like or don't like? And so when this thing happened, it like felt like a little bit of a loss of trust, but then the response was like, I have even more trust than I did at the start, because like it's about how you react to situations, not necessarily even about the situation itself. And so like and that's kind of why I framed it as further the duel of like sad versus happy day, but like also, like I have way more trust in y'all than I did before this even happened, because, when you patch up a thing successfully in like a nice way and everybody kind of like does the right thing, that's great, because there's always going to be problems. Like it's never like you're not going to ship some sort of bug that causes issues or like, make a decision that people disagree with, but it's like about how it's handled after the fact. And it was handled incredibly, incredibly well in this circumstance.
Yeah. Thanks for all the kind words. I'm happy to like make that work for people. And like, I like you talked about the contempt stuff, right? And I think like I try to do the opposite, right? Where you have this in feedback, you have this situation behavior impact thing, right? Where you have the facts on the ground and then you have some behavior and then you have the impact of the behavior. And so if you separate those, I think it's generally easier to find the right response to things. Right.
There's so many times where I post, I write in a text box like something very angry, and then I delete it, and then I write the second version, which is like, "Thank you for the feedback." You blah 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 blah. Like like it's just you got to get the first gut reaction out, and then like you're able to like actually be level headed about things.
Wait, Steve, you just skip the step where you screenshot it and send it to all your colleagues.
Yeah. I was gonna say, like,
exactly.
I do that, except I screenshot it and send it to Adam, and then Adam replies back like, "You're not posting that, right? That's actually not. No, I'm not. That's." You also reflect. I mean, Dirkjan, what you said was so wise. I think that like part of my own attraction to Rust from the beginning was a kind of inherited wisdom of the project. Of like, I mean, part of what I love about Rust writ large is a very deliberate attempt to learn from much of what has come before it. And like it shows in so many different dimensions. It shows in aspects of the language and the toolchain, but also in the community. And I think that this is like also one of the things that still to this day leaves me the most frustrated about Linux as a community is the willful ignorance of history and not wanting to actually learn anything seemingly from things that come before it is what makes it really frustrating, because it feels like you can't bring your wisdom to a community like that. Because like, you're actually not interested in learning. Like this is such an insular looking community. And I dare say, like, I don't know, Steve, I don't want to speak for Ruby, but I think that was like, it feels like there was some of that same kind of behavior, at least not for Ruby, maybe for Rails, but and I'm probably already getting myself into trouble here, but I think that it really says something about a community when it's like actively seeking that wisdom and trying. Because again, Dirkjan, I think the way you phrase it was just really reflects your own. I mean, like this is not your first rodeo. Like you're not you've obviously been at this for a number of years to kind of have that perspective.
Yep.
See, there was a moment where I was like, wait a minute. I was very frustrated because I was not able to make changes happen in Rails that I wanted to happen. And I kind of came to the realization that like, wait, how did I delude myself into the idea that this is democracy? Like David has always been very clear that Rails is his personal project and he builds it for himself and he only incidentally like lets the rest of us use it. And like, that's totally fine way to run a project if you want, but it does mean that like learnings from other things come to the degree that he is willing to like care about and or learn from other things, because it's like not really about us, it's just purely about him. And like it's weird because I think like the entire Rails community like thinks of it as like an exemplar open source project, and in many ways it sort of is, but also it's like barely an open source project in some ways, which maybe I'll get in trouble for that or whatever, but like I don't think David has ever really implied anything less than like I do everything for me and this is like the way that I want it done, and that's the thing at the end of the day ultimately. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of it is interesting because that does become, as you say, like having that kind of the BDFL model or what have you. It's like the degree that that's going to kind of look to other communities for its wisdom kind of depends on that person. And if it's kind of a BDFL model, it's like almost kind of tautologically not really looking. I mean, it's pretty inward looking at some level.
The B is
BDFL is totally fine as long as the D is B.
Yeah, as long as the D is B, exactly. Yeah. Well, so Dirkjan, how do you feel that all this kind of ended? So we got, I mean, probably perhaps more notoriety on this than you might, or but maybe this brought attention to it in a positive way. I mean, how do you feel this kind of netted out for rustup, for the community, for your own kind of feelings about it?
I'm happy that like Steve shone a positive light on it, and like maybe this Oxide and Friends episode will also help. I think for me it's not done yet because we still need to decide on a path forward, right? And so that's
Right.
might involve some further tricky conversations and painful migrations from several people, and undoubtedly some negative feedback from that. So I think ultimately we'll still have to see how it goes down when we make more of a decision on what it's going to look like in the end. But I like to think that rustup will be used more in the future. Like rustup commands will be ran more often in the future than they have been run so far. And so improving things, to your point about like having to change or being open to change, is important, because we can only have nice things if we're willing to change things. And so
Totally.
we need to be able to make changes, but we have to be careful about it and manage them well.
Well, and I think we also have to like constantly be looking for third paths where it's just too easy to kind of get in our bunker of like of one extreme or the other.
Change or not change, right?
Like wanton change or can't change at all. It's like, how about change with constraints, and then figuring out what those constraints are, and like how can we be creative about minimizing where we have to have a change that is going to break things. How can we minimize that? How can we,
try to prevent flag days, make it opt-in, or like
make it opt-in, right? Exactly.
Put up warnings first before you actually make the change, all that stuff, to make it a more gradual change where you have chances to accept feedback along the way without breaking people. So
yeah,
all that stuff.
One of my favorite related stories of this is like how Make uses tabs, because like the author, I had a dozen friends who were already using it and I didn't want to break them, so I kept tabs in even though I wanted to switch it to spaces. And like with that very insightful, like more commands will be run in the future than in the past thing, you know what I mean? Like you're like, it literally inflicted tabs on millions and millions of people or he says tens of millions in the post, but like because of not wanting to disrupt 12 people. So that's how it goes. It's a balance.
It is a balance. I look, I've known Stu for a long time. He, and I'm going to say this, I'm going to really make some friends here. Eric Allman does the same thing with SendMail. You can't have it both ways. You can't be like, because Stu is like, I am like, you may know me from Make. You're like, oh, actually, good. I've been wanting to I've been looking for you my entire life. We need to have a white space conversation. He's like, no, I didn't do it. And it's immediately like washing his hands of it. Like, no, I had a lot of people since then, and I have. It's like, look, have it one way or the other. Anyway, yeah, I agree. Though the white space in Make, and like it is a circle of hell that I have not found myself in for a really long time, is trying to find the white space mistake in this Make file. And that's our lives are much better for it.
Rust had a load bearing NOP for years in the Make file for building Rust, but anyway.
Well, I think Dirkjan, thank you first of all it's been great to have you on here, and and Steve, thank you for writing the piece. I think it was a great kind of put that in opposition to kind of this earlier episode with the where things had kind of gone off the rails. I also think, Steve, honestly, you talked about the things that you were kind of wanting to come away from in the Rails community and to make the Rust community much more welcoming. And I think that like you definitely, you were a huge influence on that and on kind of shaping the community that you wanted to live in. So I think it's, thank you for all your years and years and years in the Reddit and hacker news minds and everywhere else that you find yourself kind of helping to define what the community is.
I appreciate it. To be clear, community is made up of people, and so other people played just as much of a part. But I was like, deliberate about trying to do it. But obviously, it's a lot of other people doing work too. But yeah, I'm glad. I'm happy with where we are at, like, I don't know, someday when Rust++ happens, we'll see how that shakes out. Maybe we can do even better next time, but like, I do think that that all of us back in the day did as good of a job as anyone could ask for.
Yeah, I think we've got some good bones, and I think that the community, the part of what I kind of like about Rust is, people come from a bunch of different folkways, if you will, and at least I still remember what it's like to be new to Rust, and I think that even though it's been 7 years now or whatever, I think that and I think that's really important that we kind of treat one another with empathy. And Dirkjan, you definitely did on this, and I think felt everyone's pain, and definitely appreciate it. Especially, you got other things going on, and this is, as you say, this is all volunteer activity. Thank you very much again for your service. Very, very deeply appreciated, and we've all benefited from it. So,
thanks.
All right. Well, looking forward to I would say the next one, but I think that certainly looking forward to Dirkjan, anything we can do in terms of helping out on Rustup and the other projects that you've taken on. Really appreciate all of that. And Steve, thank you as always for deleting the first reply, I guess.
Yeah. It's been a good time.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you next time.